Please welcome Senior Customer Success Manager, Sherry Rosenkrantz.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Just as we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. We should have time at the end of the session for a Q&A. So at any point, if something sparks your interest, if you have a question, go to slido.com, enter the code SLACK, look for the Pathfinder room, and enter your questions. Again, we'll get to them towards the end of the session. And with that housekeeping out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Sherry. I'm a Customer Success Manager at Slack. And one of the best parts of my job is working with customers and learning about the impact Slack has on their organizations. I'll be joined today by two fantastic customers, Rahul Singh, Executive Mobility Director at Ford, and Kristin Dyer, Manager Internal Communication Strategy at Wayfair. They'll share their stories and experiences on how Slack enables executives in their organizations to engage directly with employees and help their teams thrive. Before I bring them to the stage, I would like to share a little bit, just a few brief thoughts on the importance of executive perspective. When Serena and Stuart were speaking this morning, and at the Pathfinder keynote, the breakout session right before this one, we talked about things like organization-wide collaboration and the increased importance of agility and alignment. So you probably, or you may just instinctively know and understand leadership, executive engagement. These things are key to these kinds of efforts. In fact, that instinctive understanding, right, it's been validated. There was an October 2018 McKinsey study that highlighted the top enablers of a successful agile transformation as transforming culture and ways of working, presence of leadership, and establishing a clear vision and roadmap. In other words, participation from executives is key to the success of these efforts. Employees look to their leaders, they follow their model, they follow their actions, so having an executive engaged can go a long way towards driving success. The absence of leadership can be one of the greatest barriers. So in other words, you've come to the right session, it's important to spend time thinking about executive perspective. So why is executive engagement challenging? Why is something that we just know inherently is important, why is that not always a given? Well, we're all busy, and executives are really busy people. It can be hard for them to have a way to easily engage with employees that's both personal and genuine and can also scale. We've seen and heard of Slack helping to overcome these challenges. So I'm curious, for folks here in the audience, if you're an executive in your organization or if there's executives at your company who are working in Slack today, raise your hand. I'm really glad some people raised their hand. Good. So that's great. Really, just keep them up for a minute because one of the best things about Frontiers is this chance we all have to meet each other, to learn from each other, to talk to each other. So we should all look around and see whose hands are up. These are great people to talk to at lunch, at a breakout, at the party, at the Explorium. They probably have some great stories and tips to share. So now raise your hand, and it's okay, we're all friends. Raise your hand if you're an executive and you're not working in Slack today. We won't judge. Or maybe there's like one or two executives in your company you've tried and you can't quite get them on board. Has that happened to anyone? Interesting. So some people, right, are working, and in the same companies, I saw the same hands go up twice, right? So we're seeing this same thing. We know it's important. Some people do it, some people don't. And so, I think one of the things that happens is Slack can be such a powerful tool. Any of us or an executive can jump into a channel. They can see what's happening in real time. They can respond, they can ask questions, they can follow up. They don't have to wait for some status, curated status report or the weekly meeting or the bi-weekly meeting or the monthly call, right? They can see what's going on in real time. At the same time, when the executive gets into Slack, particularly if it's not a way that they've worked before, it can be a little overwhelming. It might sound trivial, but it's really true. It's part of the experience, right? An executive hears about Slack, maybe people in their organization are using it, so they want to check it out. They log in, they go to Slack, they go to a channel, they look at the message, they want to respond, but they're like, what do I do? I'm a leader. Like, do I use the dancing penguin emoji? Do I use the cat? Again, it sounds silly, but these are the kind of things you need to work with your executives, right, to overcome to get them on board. And with that, I'm excited to introduce Rahul Singh from Ford, who will share his story of executive engagement. Hi. Welcome, Rahul. Thanks so much for joining us. So I'm going to pop up a slide that you had shared with me, and as I do, tell us a bit about yourself and your role at Ford.
Well, first of all, Sherry, thanks to you, thanks to the team, thanks to AJ and the greater team. Our association with Slack has been a couple of years now, and it's been deep and it's been engaging, and a lot of good growth to come. And thanks for putting on a first-class event. With myself and my background, I've got a lot of background in engineering, kind of more on the semiconductor side and then on the software side. Worked for a few startups, a few graphics companies, IPO, pre-IPO companies, before joining Ford. Originally from Canada, but got to live in the Valley here, up and down, all the way from Santa Clara to Palo Alto to the Mission. So it's nice to be back. It feels like I'm back home. At Ford, we're really thinking about emotional experiences. I'm on the mobility side and the autonomous driving side, and thinking about how we're going to build out software platforms for that and make those engaging. I've been at Ford for about 18 months, and it's been really interesting. We have a lot of people who want to join the company, and it's quite engaging. We're thinking about how this evolves in a smart city and a smart world. Did anybody grow up with a Ford either owning or in their family? Yeah, and I think we're trying to get back to the experience of like emotional experiences. So we have like the Ranger coming back, and we have the Mustang coming back in new forms, and the Bronco, which I think is kind of cool. So if you're a beach geek, that might be interesting in the future. And then for myself, why I joined Ford, like we have a real opportunity to like change mobility, right? And I think if you think of like security and safety, we do a lot of things like, for example, with police responders, right? And you think about the explorers or police responders, we're seeing that we can actually help save lives, right, with having connected fleet vehicles and having better communications through them. So a lot of interesting things going on in our space, and happy to share stories.
And so I think one of the key themes that we keep hearing about and we talk about at Slack is the importance of alignment, particularly alignment during times of change. So I'm curious, where does Slack fit in?
Yeah, so I mean, interestingly at Ford is, we work at different clock speeds. Right? So in order to make a vehicle, there's a clock speed of engineering and product that takes years to develop, right? You put a 3 to 5 year plan together, right? And then there's different clock speeds that happen in kind of month intervals, right? That happen in that area, like embedded type of stuff. And then there's the application that you kind of touch and feel, like Ford Pass or Lincoln Way, which will happen in weeks and months. And inherently, you can create silos doing that, right? And we find like what Slack does is allow people in those different groups to break those silos, right? To allow them to cross-communicate and collaborate, right? And they don't just collaborate across silos, but we get folks from those different teams embedded into one product team on one channel so that they can figure out that we're not always gearing towards the lowest common denominator or maybe the slowest common denominator, right? But we'll allow those teams to kind of work at their different clock speeds and continuously deliver value.
And so clock speeds wasn't a term I was familiar with until we started talking. And so I'm just curious to understand what that means for teams.
Yeah, so when we talk about different clock speeds, it literally it resonates with people because it doesn't mean that they have to fully change how they do things, but they have to optimize for other folks, right? And so what we hope with the team perspective in Slack is that we've seen like 2 areas where it's really helped us. One is like a vibrant workplace. Right? So we see this vibrancy in the workplace now that didn't exist because we have people connecting in different ways that they just didn't connect before. They may be in different buildings or in different geographical regions, right? And then I think secondly, the way it really affects teams, which helps me a lot too, is it's a concept that like I like to call like knowledge over hierarchy, right? So oftentimes the person with the best answer is not in that biweekly status meeting that you were referring to. They may not even be in the meeting, or they may not have a demeanor where they're comfortable with speaking up in the meeting, right? So a lot of times that gets curated, but what we find with Slack is like the person with that knowledge, can just answer that question in real time or give their point of view or their perspective on it without waiting for inhibitors, right? And we find that ends up being more empowering to people, right? But then it allows us to learn off each other better, right? So really, like, who's got the knowledge? Let's get that out of them and break away that hierarchy that inherently happens within teams.
So let's talk about you. So how do you navigate through these different teams, these different bits of knowledge, right? How do you navigate through these different clock speeds?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think I'm still learning, right? For me, what I usually try to do, and Slack empowers me to do this, is like just build trust, right? So I want to build trust within all elements that I do at work with the folks I work with and our partners. But the way I try to build trust in Slack is not to be, hey, where's the status, like in the Slack channel or stuff like that, right? It's being an equal participant of it and an observer, and even like when small things happened, like just for me to write boom, like that really stuff, right? Yeah. I think those type of things like help build trust, right? And then the trust is always two ways, right? And then it allows employees not to wait for some type of meeting where I do like big Q&As. We can just have those kind of conversations like within Slack. So hopefully that's much more approachable. I think it's not as intrusive as a text message, right? Yep. But it's within there, so it can be a direct message or within the channel.
So it's getting you closer to the teams and where the work is actually happening.
Yeah, and I think building that trust allows people to be more transparent, where they can share their point of view more often. And I'm a big believer is like, if we can get everybody's balanced teams' point of views on the table, there'll be some debate earlier on, but we'll get to the right result.
Got it. And so what about collaboration between executives? So you've talked about teams, how you engage with your teams. Yeah. What about your executives? I think what I'm really asking is, do you leverage Slack for communicating with execs?
Yeah. I find it's much easier to collaborate with the teams. It's a bit more of a journey to collaborate with execs, to be honest, right? I think it's a bit of a journey. So like I'd say like 40 to 60% of us, like within our mobility and AV unit, are like deeply ingrained with the teams, and not all of them are there yet. But it's really interesting because I'll get like anecdotal stories of like, I think it builds a lot of empathy for like an executive team if you can connect that way, and I'll have like peers of mine saying, well, how did you get that information? Or like, how did you, like, we don't even have that meeting until next week. And I'm like, well, I'm on the channel. Like, I saw the release, right? Like, it's there. The team's struggling with this. Like, we should show some support or let them know that we're around, right? So I think inherently getting that information they don't have access to, usually they kind of turn around and say, well, wait a minute, like, I'm missing out on something, right? So then my hope is that then they get more involved in seeing the value of that participation. And I think the other thing I'm trying to work on is just the collaboration just within the executive team, within that. But I think that's just something that's been around for generations, right? Like that type of thing. So I think that's still a work in progress, but we're getting there.
There's so much about it that I love, about your answer that I love, right? Because it's not necessarily just about Slack. The idea is executives who are in Slack are closer to the information, closer to the knowledge. So you're not saying you need to be in Slack to be in Slack. You're saying, yeah, if you want to know what's going on and have this information, come to the conversation.
Exactly, and to build on that, a lot of us ended up working with Ford Mobility through startups that got acquired, and we acquired them and stuff like that. And we all worked in Slack, right? And then we brought that into Slack in a greater workspace. And at some point, people, it's valuable when there's a risk of taking it away, right? And then people are like, well, no, you're not going to take it away. We're just going to expand it and continue it with the broader group, right? And so now we're starting to see that expansion start to unfold.
Right, and you said it's still a work in progress, and getting executives on board has taken work. Has that been the biggest challenge, or has there been something else?
When I think about agile, right? And I think agile is like an overused term now, right? So I actually try to avoid it. But like one of my goals in the workplace is like to think about feedback loops, right? And like how can we make the feedback loops shorter and shorter and shorter? And to me, like that's one of kind of the essences of agile. Like I used to be a Pivotal, and other companies used to think about this a lot. And anyway, like whether it's a stand-up, right? Whether it's a quick code review, whether it's review on mocks, and all the stuff you can do in Slack, right? Is like how do you make those feedback loops smaller and smaller and smaller? So I think that's the challenge that I first looked at, is like, how do we take this from months to getting like immediate smaller feedback in smaller cycles, release to the customer, get feedback, and then keep going, right? So we've played with a lot of different ways where we can just get those feedback loops tighter, right? And leveraging Slack in those areas with the integrations and such like that, and you can just see the results, right? Because it's changing the mindset of like, I need to wait this long of a time and get something letter perfect, right, before I ask for feedback, and saying, hey, I'm going to have some trust. I'm going to expose what we're doing a little bit early, get some feedback, iterate more quickly, but in that same amount of time, we're going to get something better.
I think that that brings it back to clock speeds, which we were talking about at the beginning. So whether your development cycle is days, weeks, month, you're not a developer working on this presentation, right? Whatever it is you're doing, that idea of working iteratively and openly and building that common trust, right, kind of can help accelerate things. Just to wrap up, what was one thing that surprised you?
Just the organic recognition, right? That it was kind of cool. It's like, oftentimes we force recognition, like we'll wait for an all hands and, we do that. And I think that there's still a good place for that. But just recognition that happens within the Slack channels. Folks giving kudos to each other, folks getting visibility on what others are doing and recognizing it. When early on, like I'd get invited to this party where we did like a launch, and there'd be like a big cake, right? And then we had this cake at the launch. So I was like, hey, this is amazing. I was like, when's the next launch? And it'd be months away. I was like, how do we break that down into smaller stuff, right? And then we got into this thing of like, how do we go from cakes to cupcakes, right? So like, instead of like us ordering cakes like once a quarter or even longer, why don't we just order cupcakes every Thursday, right? And have smaller cupcakes and start doing these things. And it just became like one of those quirky things, but it kind of got a power of its own. And then somebody made a cupcake channel, right? And when somebody did a release, whether it was small or larger and stuff like that, they kind of showed it on there, and other people kind of gave kudos to each other. We didn't plan it, but it was kind of recognition that, again, I think that was organic. And when you see that kind of stuff, then you know that you've starting to create that vibrant workplace that I was talking about earlier, and you get that good feeling that you're onto something real.
So more cake and more cupcakes. I think one of the other things you had mentioned is like where is the Cupcake channel most active?
Oh, it's funny because we have a global team, obviously, and the folks who created the Cupcake channel were in London, and the biggest contributors to the Cupcake channel are in Chennai. Right, so now we're thinking about different worldly desserts and being global of different types of things. So it's kind of got some legs on its own. But again, I think the global perspective that like we're bringing of like a team in London working on a totally different project than a team doing like a shuttle type of application in Chennai are giving each other kudos, which is kind of cool to see.
That's great. So you've just done such a phenomenal job of leading by example, right? The idea that people look to their leaders, they see how they're engaging, and then that kind of transcends down into the culture, how people engage, how people build up trust. I know sometimes, right, that happens organically and that works based on leadership style. Other times, executives will work and kind of partner up with other teams, right? Executives don't have to go it alone. And I think one great example of that has been at Wayfair, the way that the internal comms team, so internal comms can be a great partner to executives. And I think the internal comms team has done a great job working with their executives to get people on board and increase engagement. And with that, I'd like to introduce Kristin Dyer from Wayfair to tell her story of executive engagement.
Hi.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you.
I like your jumpsuit.
Oh, thank you.
Anyways, I'm on the wrong question. I will go to the next slide while I sort these. So tell me a bit about Wayfair and your role.
Absolutely. Wayfair believes that everyone should live in a home that they love, and we have become the world's largest online destination for the home with this laser focus on the customer experience. So we have delivered that through innovation and technology to really optimize that experience. As a result, though, and unavoidably, one of our challenges has been our internal systems and our internal communications tools have not scaled quite as fast as the business. We were used to communicating as a small startup and, less effective with 12,000 people. So one of the things that I started doing when I came on in January 2018 was start really assessing on a holistic level where we're at and where we can improve with communications. And a core part of that is executive engagement.
Great. And so where does Slack fit into that comms work?
Absolutely. Slack, I leveraged previous to our enterprise-wide rollout just as a tool to communicate with my direct coworkers, to follow the Wayfair puppy pics channel, all critically important things. But in addition to that, when I started talking to you all and we were rolling out company-wide, I realized that this was a great opportunity to incorporate the tool into our overall comms planning. So I did do that. It's now considered as a platform where we'll get the word out. And then also John Mullican, who is our CTO, he had this vision for executive engagement where we would create a space that our execs could communicate in real time with our employees. And that actually became the AMA channels.
Got it. And just in case people aren't familiar, I know we talked about them earlier. What is an AMA?
Yep, it's an open forum, typically for a set amount of time, where the host will answer any question that you can think of across the gamut.
Got it. And you were using Slack. So how did you get executives involved in these AMAs?
Because John was he's such a pioneer of the platform and he is a great collaborator, his team did the initial lift to engage the first couple of executives. From there, I went ahead and met with Margaret Lawrence, who is the leader of our B2B business, to really discuss what she could expect hosting the first session, what I expected hosting the first session, but really it was that we weren't sure what to expect. So we were going to prepare as much as we could, but it was going to be a learning experience for both of us. So what we did was we went ahead and actually created sensitive topics talking points, and that really allowed Margaret during the session to focus on sharing the human side and her personality, rather than talking about a policy that might already be in our employee handbook.
So hopefully the prep paid off. How did it go?
So our first question of our first AMA ever was, would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses?
Good thing you prepped.
So yeah, the prep key. So despite my immediate horror, it really did create the sense of levity in the room with myself and Margaret, and then also in the channel, that people felt more free to ask additional questions. One of the questions that they ended up getting to after the horse debacle was, what was Margaret's most challenging part of joining Wayfair? And we are growing and onboarding people at a very rapid rate, so things change a lot. She joined 2.5 years ago and very candidly answered this. It was coming into an organization that was in deep transition, and though it was something that was unexpected for her, it was a great learning opportunity. And then she went on to encourage everyone else, step outside your comfort zone. That's where the learning happens, and that's where you'll get it done.
And I think all these things, like the examples Rahul talked about with Cupcakes and executives in channels, boom, sharing enthusiasm, or an executive kind of being human and answering those questions, really helps build trust, right? It really helps build culture, pardon me. So what happened after that? Was it a one and done AMA? Did you have more of these events?
We did. We are now planning them on a monthly basis. Steve Oblak, who is our chief merchandising officer, was the second to host. He differed a little bit from Margaret. Margaret had used the platform day to day, not quite as much to host a large audience. Steve was a bit more uncomfortable with the platform, so we spent some time really just going through the basics, also talking about some of the best practices of the channel. So during the AMA itself, he could really focus on being himself.
So it sounds like setting those expectations was really key. What kind of feedback did you get from the executives?
Yeah, Margaret right away got fantastic feedback from her peers, which was something that was really nice for me to leverage later on. They thought, this is she did a great job. How am I going to do better than this? And it sort of created this competitive experience for all of them. So she got great feedback. And then one of our newer employees DM'd me right after the session, and she let me know that Steve was so cool, so funny. She wants to be his friend. And I don't know if any of you work with Gen Z folks, but it is so hard to be cool in their eyes that was such a huge win for me. So, that was great.
I love it. So, this idea of being human, connecting, I think helps build trust, kind of, Rahul, to your point, whatever you're working on, whatever the speed, when you have this familiar environment, like Stu was talking about this morning, this sense of alignment, I think it really just makes it easier for everyone to get their work done and work towards that same goal when they have the trust. So just to round this out, the same question I'd asked Rahul, was there anything that surprised you?
Yes. Honestly, it was just the willingness for our employees to just step out of that veil of anonymity and go for those hard-hitting questions and just really ask something that they really wanted to know, not something that they thought was politically correct at the moment. And then additionally, I learned that Steve, our chief merchandising officer, was a massive fan of Game of Thrones, and I swear this makes sense, but basically, he introduced himself. He wanted to be fun and cool and let us know it was a huge week for Wayfair. Way Day was happening that week, our biggest sale of the year. But almost more importantly, the Game of Thrones Season 8 premiere would cap off the week. So later on in the channel, he was talking about some hard-hitting questions, some personality questions, and someone actually asked if he wanted to be a part of their Season 8 death bracket. Which he did. So he actually joined their bracket team and met with them live that week. And even though that's sort of perhaps a little bit weird, it's exactly the type of connections that we're looking to make with the AMAs.
So Cupcakes, Game of Thrones, I mean, it sounds lighthearted, but I think that really is the key point. The idea is through this kind of human interaction, right, we all realize, despite the hierarchy, we're all human beings working towards some kind of a common goal. So thanks, guys, so much for answering the questions. I am going to open it up to AMA, not AMA, well, I guess AMA of you.
AMA.
Open it up to Q&A, lots of A's there, and I will bring up this slider thing. Okay. So just one question first. I was curious, we didn't really talk about this yet, about executive assistants. How are you guys engaging with executive assistants, and how does that help with executive enablement?
At Wayfair, our executive assistants, and I'm pretty sure anywhere, will say it takes a village to support our executives. And they've really found that Slack is a convenient way to find and contact that village. So they leverage it quite frequently. We also have a dedicated IT team to the EAs, so they're in a channel together. Should anything go out of whack, then they get priority to be taken care of.
And Rahul, what about at Ford with you?
I think at Ford, in the mobility AV space, we're moving more towards like office managers, right, within there, as opposed to like executive assistants, and they're fully engaged in Slack, but they're engaged in more than just the executives, right? They're engaged in like the happiness of that. And my ultimate goal, I'm not there yet, is actually just get a happiness director, right, for the team and the greater team, and have them engaged accordingly.
Awesome. So next question. Do you have any tips for how executives can reduce noise and how to make sure they're engaging in the right conversations?
I would say something that has really helped us is naming conventions, so people really know what they're getting when they join a channel. We have announcements channels, which are specific to sort of global impact news items or location-specific news items. And then we have more fun channels, like the puppies that I mentioned. So the naming conventions were really key there.
Yeah, I think I try to turn noise into focus, right? Like, and how do you make that path of getting noise more into focus? So we're really big on like OKRs, right? And OKRs or KPI type of mindset. And then we actually try to make those KPIs or OKRs like automated reporting, right? And then that just reports into Slack, right? So like we just take those results or those dashboards and we have a bot running and they kind of just post, I think it's like every Friday or Monday, and they post in there. So it keeps some of the noise down, because when the noise comes up, it's like, hey, is that really part of the focus that we're really trying to achieve, as defined by like what we agreed to in the metrics, and that, I think, to me, it's like move noise to focus, and that's just one of the techniques we use.
Yeah. Got it. And none of us, and no executive, no one's going to read every message in Slack. So I think both those tips, naming conventions and just thinking about organization, so you go to a channel and you see what has more of an announcement, what's kind of ongoing work, you can pick where to go deep and where to kind of just watch. So another question, how do you stay aligned in remote settings when part of your team is based in a different time zone? What are the best practices for using Slack? And I think, Rahul, I'll start with you since you have cupcakes all over the world.
Yeah, we have global teams, and we have what we first of all try to do is keep our teams co-located. We make our bigger products into smaller products, like the 2 pizza size team that goes around, and make them into smaller teams. But often these smaller teams are just not in the same location, right? And it is how it is. We use Slack and we use other forms of communication mediums to keep that. I think the virtual connection is just much easier than it used to be. Slack is just one of the tools. Like, we have it to an extent where some of our programmers use pair programming, so it's like 2 programmers on like one code base, and we have an example where they're actually in different continents, right? And they have headsets and all that, and they always have a Slack channel open, right, that they communicate through. So I think it's a medium that can help you bridge those gaps.
For us, we do have locations all over the world. Our European headquarters is in Germany, so just quickly, for some of the more global announcements, we'll make sure that they're time zone friendly. So it might be something that's a little bit more earlier at Wayfair Boston, and then something that's a little later in the afternoon for them. We also have location-specific channels when it makes more sense for some of those communications to be at the local time zone. For example, we had a Way Day internal activation, so it made much more sense for me to communicate with our USA employees and then the folks over in Europe, letting people know when they could get their cupcakes. Critically important stuff.
Got it. So next question, I just want to make sure I do get them all. Do your organization set policies for how execs will respond over Slack, or do you leave it up to each individual? So is there a consistent expectation, or is it kind of open-ended? Might be different at Wayfair and Ford.
I'm very much against policies, that type of stuff. So I'm like, the policy should be like, use your best judgment and be professional, right? And if we find something that's kind of out of the box, we just talk to that person and address it and kind of get the background.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to add to that, Kristin, just thinking of some of our earlier conversations, I think there can be expectations of executives getting into Slack about how to respond, but also the timeliness, right? That can be a barrier. An executive thinks, I'm going to jump into this thing. Am I going to have to be responding kind of right away?
Absolutely. One of the things that we did ahead of the AMA specifically is, since that was a sort of set time for the executives, that was okay. We also launched a founders AMA, which was intended to be a 24 hours a day channel where Neeraj and Steve, our founders, would answer questions. But that said, you don't want to disappoint people if they ask a question and they haven't heard back. And these questions were very well thought out. So in order to thoroughly and thoughtfully answer the questions, we set up guidelines that they could expect a complete answer in 72 hours, and so that pretty much worked out.
And if I could add on to that, I think the engagement with executives is like a two-way street, right? As well. So like, what I encourage like my teams to do is that, look, I'm not going to respond to all the messages, nor do you want me to, right? But if there is something you want to respond to me to, then tag me, right? So if there's a method there and you say, hey, just tag Rahul on it, then I will know, it'll come into my alerts, and then I'll jump in. But other than that, the expectation isn't that I would go in and read all of them and have that deep knowledge. But that's also a way for individuals who are not execs in the room, right, to drag those people in. And I don't even think they have to be execs. They can just be anybody on the team. If you want to bring them in the conversation, tag them and be like, hey, what do you think about this? What are your thoughts, right? And that's a really good way to get people involved rather than top down or anything else.
So this is like an AMA in real life. Here's the next question. In AMAs, how do you help execs answer questions that are totally outside their work? In one of ours, someone asked the CEO why the toilets in the office flush so loudly.
Well, that feels like something that should have gone on the sensitive topic talking points. We also just realized that that's going to happen, so we have just a set contact for some of those things. We have a fantastic community experience team, so I would just sort of try to shut that one down and have the exec recommend them reach out to that contact, because some they don't need to spend their time on.
Agreed. Enough time on toilets? Yeah, okay. Anyways, all right, I think maybe to wrap it up with another question. How do you manage risk with tactics like AMAs? Are Slack threads, as Slack threads are discoverable in legal action, how do you control inappropriate questions or answers? So not trivial, but an answer right now is discoverable, and
right.
What does that mean?
To that, I always like to say it's discoverable anywhere. Anyone can take a screenshot of an email. Anyone can take a recording of your all hands meeting. Anyone can take a screenshot of Slack. So what helps us is just having really thoughtful executives in that arena who really do feel passionate about the things that they're answering. But also, like I said, the sensitive topics were really helpful to point people toward those resources that already existed, so nothing gets taken out of context.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, I think I totally agree with you. It's not the medium in that case, right, or Slack or anything else. For me, the experience that I've gained over time is, again, I think it's back to those feedback loops I was speaking about earlier, is that if you let things build up and you don't do like an AMA or a question for like a quarter or something like that, you may get more oddball questions, right? And just my personal experience, at least, is like, if you just do it every week and you take questions, you'll see like the quality and the thoughtfulness of the questions go up, because other people see what other questions are going, and then they're getting more popular and they get more voted or thumbs up, right? And or secondly, just do it in real time. Like, one of the takeaways that I got from this morning is like, why don't I just have like a Rahul AMA channel that's like always open, and then people can always ask questions. And the advantage of that is that if someone just joins the team on Monday, they could go to that channel, right? And they could see like all the questions that were asked over the past several months, right? Mm-hmm. So again, I think if you're just very open about it and you have a high frequency, my guess is like those quality of questions will probably go up.
So we have time for one last question. What impact did getting executives on Slack have on Slack use throughout your company? Did it cause more people to use Slack, and did it increase engagement?
I would say people, they really valued Slack as a tool. We have this sort of test and then roll out. So I had been using Slack and some other teams had. So we knew the value, but then having the executives and some of these things ready to go right as we're launching was super helpful to say, okay, well, I'm going to miss this AMA channel, or I'm going to miss this announcement if I'm not on Slack and getting these news pieces.
Yeah, and I would say, I think if you think about engagement in Slack, a lot of it has to do with like the UI and the interface, which is fantastic, right? I think secondly, it's the integrations that you put in and the thought you put into those integrations. But I think the overarching, to me, is like just to make Slack list more than just a messaging tool is the content, right? Is the content that you have in there, right? Is there real content? Is there actionable? Obviously, there's a fun element to it, but if you get real content in there, then you'll get engagement, and you'll get people coming in. And then for that content, think about like the different gears of content, right? You have folks on the development team all the way to the executive team. So can you cater to different type of content? And if you've got good high quality content in there, then the rest, I think the engagement goes up.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Rahul and Kristin, for sharing your stories, and thanks for some really good questions. I know we didn't quite get to all of them. We'll see how to answer them. As we wrap up, my hope is that you've been inspired by these stories and that you are excited to go back to your organizations and continue the work to get your executives engaged and working in Slack, not just for Slack, but really for the benefit of your company and working together towards common goals. As we wrap up, I wanted to just quickly, because it's flashing, wanted to quickly recap the key takeaways. First and foremost, the simplest thing is for executives to log in, to engage, to just be human, to just try, learn, iterate. At the same time, ask for help, right? Employees want to see their leaders in Slack. We at Slack can help. They really want to see their employees. Let me say that again. Employees want to engage with their leaders. They want to know what's on their leaders' minds, and Slack is one way to help with that. We can help on the Slack side to get executives on board. You can work with internal comms teams. You can work with your Slack admins and owners, right? Executives should not be afraid to ask for some help or perhaps put some boundaries or guidelines around that through something like an Ask Me Anything. And finally, don't forget about EAs. Spending some time enabling executive assistants can go a long way towards helping to get your teams on board. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and we'll break for lunch, and then we'll be back over at the main stage at 1 o'clock for the product innovation keynote and spotlight. Thank you.